Today's movie, it all comes down to perspective. Hello and welcome to Rotted Review of the Day, and today we continue the Halloween franchise series, this time with the 2007 Rob Zombie remake of the original Halloween. This was a weird one for me. I remember watching this one, I remember liking this one, but it had been several years, and I watched it yesterday, and I honestly thought about postponing this review. The reason for that is because I found this on an analytical level to be terribly difficult. This was a movie that I couldn't figure out exactly what it was. There was something about it that needed to be addressed. Something about it that didn't sit well with me, and something about it that didn't make it cohesive as a film. And I was really having trouble putting my finger on it, to the point where I even thought about sitting here and recording a video here and releasing it as a postponement. So I'm going to just try and get back to you tomorrow kind of announcement. I haven't forgotten to do this series. I need a day to meditate on this one. And I wound up sleeping on it, and I was reading up on IMDb, and I don't know how true this fact is, but this little trivia tidbit that came up sparked it in my brain, exactly how I felt about it and why I felt about it the way I did. But this little trivioid fact thing here that is unverified is that when Rob Zombie came to the Weinstein brothers to pitch his ideas, he came with two films in mind. One was an origin story, and the other was a straight remake, and they didn't like that. I think from the verbiage of what I was reading, they just wanted the remake, and because of this, he incorporated the origin story into it. All right, that was enough. That I figured it out from there. I'm going to go ahead and describe this movie. Basically, what this movie does is, from a plot level, is we start off with the Michael Myers character as a young boy, and we show his family life in much, much greater detail than in the 1978 John Carpenter original. We see the dysfunctional nature of his family. We see him getting bullied at school. We see psychopathic tendencies. The seeds have been planted, and then we watch them grow. We watch them being watered and fertilized and fostered and cared for until they finally grow and come to fruition through verbal abuse and through tension in family life and this perfect storm of external and internal factors, as Dr. Loomis in this movie said. And ultimately what it comes down to is he does slaughter his family, and then we see him being put in the mental institution. We see him being cared for by Dr. Loomis as a child, as he regresses further and further, becomes more and more nonverbal, and slides more and more into his fascination of hiding within himself behind these physical masks that he creates. Until it fast forwards 15 years later, and he is a full-grown adult, and through terrible circumstances happens to escape the asylum, and then seeks his vengeance out on Haddonfield. And the rest of the movie is pretty much, kind of know how it goes from there. So here's the thing about this movie. I know that it's very polarizing. A lot of people seem to really like it. A lot of people seem to really hate it. And I kind of wound up somewhere in the middle, as I often find myself doing in situations like this. I didn't outright hate this movie. There were parts of it that I found to be extraordinarily enjoyable. But I think what this ultimately comes down to, as I said in the opening stinger there, is a matter of perspective. And that is the biggest problem with this movie. And what I wound up realizing amidst myself and with that trivia fact is that the biggest problem with this movie is perspective. This should not have been a single movie. This should have been a separate, broken out 2-movie deal. The reason I say that is because the biggest problem with this film is, for the first time in the Halloween franchise, our main character, our protagonist, is Michael Myers. And for an origin story, that works quite well. And that was a portion of this movie that I really liked. It didn't necessarily fit within the style of a traditional Halloween Michael Myers wreaking havoc on Haddonfield level, but through its own contained storyline and the actors and the characters and so forth that were portraying that, everything about watching him through his adolescence and then slaughtering his family and getting put in the asylum and then growing into the monster he became, I liked it. And I know some people didn't, but I did. Again, not as a Halloween movie, but as a Michael Myers movie. And I think that's critical. That's key. And that's a big part of what this problem was. Is, a protagonist isn't necessarily a hero. It's just simply the main character. It's who we are following. And like I said, this is the first time in a Halloween franchise that I believe the protagonist of this entire film was Michael Myers. And for a slasher, that doesn't really work that well. It's very, very Rob Zombie. It's extraordinarily Rob Zombie to center his movies around the monster and then make the monster sympathetic. It's one of the things I love the most about The Devil's Rejects. I'm going to get into my review of that when I, get into it. But suffice it to say, an early preview of that, just my general feeling of it, is one of the things I love the most about The Devil's Rejects is it establishes these monsters. It doesn't do anything whatsoever to redeem them, and yet through the external factors around them and through the cinematic style, by the end of the movie, you are rooting for them. It's a very Rob Zombie thing. It's honestly a very Mary Shelley thing to take the concept of the monster and then have such exterior factors in play that you actually feel sympathetic for them. And then, start to question who the real monsters are. It's not an original idea, but it's one that isn't touched on a whole lot, and it's not touched on with so deft a hand that it works terribly well in a lot of circumstances. But Rob Zombie has pulled it off in the past, and I think for the first half of this movie, he did pull it off with Michael Myers. But I think that only works insofar as an origin story to make us sympathetic with him. As far as the wreaking havoc on Haddonfield and Laurie Strode and so forth, I think that that's a totally different concept, and that's why we needed two different movies. Not necessarily because this is the longest of the Halloween movies so far, at over 2 hours long, but mostly because of that perspective. This really would have worked better, in my opinion, if we had established an origin story, a Michael Myers kind of the beginning, the prelude, whatever you want to call it, and had the Dr. Loomis character as the linchpin, as somebody that was present in both universes, in both films, as both the prelude and the proper Halloween remake, and he would carry the story. He wouldn't be our main character, he wouldn't be our protagonist, but he would be the linchpin to carry the story from the perspective of Michael Myers in the first one to the Laurie Strode character in the second one. Now the handshake has been passed off, and we have an established villain. We have an established villain that we're sympathetic towards, but we have a new protagonist, something that the second movie could focus on more. As a unified, single, cinematic, theatrical experience, it didn't really work that well because we didn't have that shift of perspective. It established the Laurie Strode character, but it never really passed the movie down to her in terms of making her the protagonist. And honestly, if it had tried to do that much of a tonal shift at the halfway mark in the movie, it really wouldn't have worked. Maybe that's what they tried to do, and maybe that's why it didn't work. But I maintain that Michael Myers was our protagonist throughout the entirety of the film, and for an origin story, that works. For a slasher, it didn't, and for an entire contained movie, it wound up falling flat on its face. So I'm going to go and throw up all the scores here. As always, 4 different categories, each one worth up to 25 points for a total possible score of 100 points. And I think in each and every individual case, as far as plot, intent, acting, and the technical only because mostly down to like editing and things along those lines. But I think in each and every one of those cases, it would have been, I wanted to give it higher marks because of those elements that I really liked. But I think it would have gotten higher marks individually as 2 different movies than it did collectively cramming them into one. So all of the marks suffered by trying to have these 2 concepts crammed together. And another aspect of perspective that may or may not kind of be an element of why this movie is so divisive is the perspective of the audience as to whether or not they're watching a Halloween movie or if they're watching a Rob Zombie movie. Now, apparently, Rob Zombie, when he had the idea to make this, he went to John Carpenter, necessarily for his blessing, but just, informing him what's going on, just giving him a heads up, kind of professional courtesy. And John Carpenter, I don't know about an official blessing, but he said, okay, well, make it your own. And he did. He very much did. This felt like a Rob Zombie movie through and through. It's just kind of whether we're watching a Halloween movie or a Rob Zombie movie, and whether or not in the Venn diagram, how big that middle section can possibly be, how much Rob Zombie feel can go into this while still maintaining the feel of a Halloween Michael Myers movie. And that is kind of one of the questionable things about this. For me, this felt a little bit more like a Rob Zombie movie than a Halloween movie. You had the cavalcade of actors, and it's one of the things I liked about this one, but it's also one of the things that made it feel much more like a pet project of Rob Zombie than a contained Halloween story. But you had Brad Dourif, you had Tyler Mane, Sherry Moon Zombie, William Forsythe, Clint Howard, Danny Trejo, Tim Toles, Bill Moseley, Sid Haig. The list goes on, and that's just kind of the major players of Rob Zombie films. Again, no complaints. I love them. And there's a part of me that really loves the whole kind of, hellbilly style of the Rob Zombie films. Again, it's just that Venn diagram. Is it one? Is it the other? Is it somewhere in between? It's a little tough to tell. It's a matter of perspective. That being said, I do think that Tyler Mane especially needs to be really called out on this one, because the one thing that I really liked about this movie is not necessarily the performance of the Michael Myers character necessarily, but just on a physical level, the way he's presented, the way the cameras are angled to show him, the way the security guards are standing next to him. This is, bar none, the most intimidating, scary, on-screen incarnation of the Michael Myers character that I think has happened to, up until the movie was made, to date at the time of release, I guess you'd call it. He casts such an imposing figure as 6'8", beefy, burly, intimidating, but one of the things that makes that a little bit unrealistic is how flippant the security guards were about bullying him. Basically, I don't know of anybody that would be on such a power trip that they would bully somebody of this stature, at least not without some sort of reservation or hesitation. But regardless, everybody in the Rob Zombie movies, everybody in this movie that is surrounding Michael Myers is pretty much absolutely horrible. A few characters are pretty nice, but it honestly doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. But for the most part, 98% of this, the people in this film are absolute, just miserable, terrible, terrible people. And again, that's very much kind of the Rob Zombie, even Mary Shelley kind of thing, just kind of external factors making the monster more sympathetic. So all told, 58 out of 100 points. This was a tough one for me to nail down, but I think I did nail down exactly what it was I didn't like about it. And taking into account that, as well as what I did like about it, because I do think there were several elements that did work, it wound up in a place of kind of a moderate score within the franchise. A little bit less than 4, a little bit higher than 5, things like that. So, and I think that, just kind of thinking generally about how I feel about this movie, I think that's pretty accurate. I think this wasn't at all the greatest of the series. But as far as all the hate that it gets, I don't think that that's necessarily all that well deserved. I mean, if you're not a Rob Zombie fan and you're not a fan of his style and the hellbilly kind of, gritty, dirt in the wound kind of thing, then okay, you're not going to like this one, and that's fine. That's fair. But I don't know. It's a matter of perspective, and this is my perspective on this movie. So that should about do it. That's my review of 2007's Halloween Remake, directed by Rob Zombie. I really thank you for joining me here today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow as I review Halloween 2. And if you like this video, please click like and subscribe. If you want to support me further, my Patreon and my merchandise storefront links are below. Remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.